All right, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. Darren Crouch is the current president of the GBC, the 501c6, as well as the co-founder and president of environmentally responsible funeral product company Passages International Incorporated. Darren has been associated with the GBC almost since its inception and has been a board member for almost 10 years. He has recently been recognized on the TIME100 Climate list of business leaders driving climate action and attended the Time100 Dinner in Rio de Janiero. Congratulations, Darren. We're all very proud of Darren. He's also been published in the Director Magazine, the American Funeral Director Magazine, Funeral Business Advisor, the Cremationist, the ICCFA Magazine Memento Mori, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Darren has presented at several national and international conventions, including the Asia Funeral Expo, the National Funeral Directors Convention, the ICCFA Convention, and both the New Jersey and California State Funeral Directors Conventions this year. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Darren. Welcome, Darren. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Maura. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining me for this webinar. I'm proud and honored to lead the Green Burial Council toward a more sustainable and meaningful funeral for everyone. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the 100% volunteer board, our business administrator, Krista, and all of our amazing volunteers that support the organization and keep the wheels turning and moving forward. None of this important work could happen without them. In this webinar, I'd like to share what the Green Burial Council does, why it's important, and why we work closely to educate and advocate for green burial amongst the general public and certify and educate funeral professionals. So let's get started and look at who wants green burial and why they want it. So there's a lot of data out there from independent sources in the funeral industry. If we look at the National Funeral Directors Association, or Kate Boylston's publication. Kate Boylston publishes a magazine. It's a trade magazine in the industry, and they've done some surveys over the years. And this survey from 2022 shows how more and more consumers, in fact, over 90% of consumers think being environmentally friendly when it comes to funerals or burials is important. And more people, probably over 70% of people, are somewhat familiar with green burials and green funerals. And you can see on the chart on the left, kind of gives the reasons why. Obviously, just under 40% of people are interested in green burial for the environmental reasons and benefits. Other people like the fact that it can often be less expensive. And there's several other reasons. But you can see from this data, there's significant interest around green burial. If you look at some other studies, this is also an NFDA study from 2024. When asked if the consumer was interested in green funeral services, almost 70% said yes. Only 13 or 14% said no, they're not interested. So there's overwhelming interest in greener funerals. And more people have attended funerals in a non-traditional location. And I think about, weddings and births and, people no longer just get married in the church. They no longer have their babies in hospitals. They're having midwives deliver their babies at home and in birthing centers. People are getting married on the beach. And so it makes perfect sense that, of course, people will be looking for different locations and more unique and sentimentally significant locations to have their funerals. The interesting thing, and this is one of the reasons that I think it's really important that we are bridging the gap between interested consumers that want green burial and the funeral profession that is becoming more equipped to deliver those products and services, is because when individuals are surveyed, the vast majority of individuals, almost 85% of people say that if they were going to plan a funeral, they would do at a funeral home. And I think, there's definitely a movement towards home funerals, death doulas, those types of things. And there's definitely a place for that, and that's growing. But a lot of people don't want to do it all on their own. And so it's really important that we engage with the funeral professionals, because for the majority of people, they're the entity that families are going to go to when they experience a loss. Another piece of information here, if you were offered a choice of a green burial, would it be something you would consider? Almost 85% of people say yes. So there's no doubt there's significant interest amongst the general public in green. This chart shows what people say they're going to do. We can't ignore the elephant in the room, which is cremation. If you look nationally, cremation on average is over 60%. And if you go to a major metropolitan area, some places it's 80%, even in the South, places like Raleigh, North Carolina, those types of places, the cremation rate is really high. And so we have to consider, how can we green cremation? A smaller percentage are choosing casketed burial, but I think what's interesting when you look at this, the green burial numbers in relation to the casketed burials, that looks like about 30% of people that are interested in burial would want to do a green burial. So significant interest happening. So I think it's important, we've established there's significant interest in green burial. So now let's look at what it is. And let's have a quick overview. I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty, but green burial is an environmentally conscious approach to death care. It prioritizes a low carbon footprint, conservation, and worker health. And I like to explain it this way, where conventional funerals over the last 100+ years have been about preserving the body, right? Preserving the body with embalming fluids, putting that body in a metal or wood casket, putting that casket in some kind of liner or vault in a grave, and then putting a permanent headstone on it. It's about permanence. Green burial is about returning to the earth like every other living thing does when it dies, right? And so when we look at the body for green burial, we want to forego toxic embalming fluids, primarily for worker health, but also interrupting the decomposition of the body if the body is embalmed. The container we need to look at, what is the body placed in? There are some practicalities that we need to factor when we are dealing with a deceased individual, whether it's a shrouded body on a backboard, on a carrier, or whether it's in some kind of casket. For green burial, all of those things need to be eco-friendly, sustainable, renewable, and go back to the earth. And of course, we don't want to use a vault because we want everything to go back to the earth as quickly as possible. When we look at cemeteries and the land use around green burial, we certify at the Green Burial 3 different kinds of cemetery. We certify hybrid cemetery, natural cemetery, and conservation burial grounds. And I'll show you a graphic that kind of explains pretty clearly what the difference between natural burial and conventional burial is. And you can see from this graphic that generally speaking, the graves are smaller, narrower, shallower. And that's in part because, the shrouds and the caskets are smaller and narrower. But also we want the body to be as close to the surface as possible so that microbes and other organisms can do their thing in terms of breaking down the body in the container. You can see, as I mentioned, that the casket or the shrouded body is placed directly into the earth, often on organic material like leaves, straw, branches, that kind of thing to help with the decomposition. And the graves in a natural cemetery or a conservation cemetery would have a natural stone or a GPS type marking, but they wouldn't have, an imported granite headstone or a cast bronze marker, that type of thing. You'll also notice at a green cemetery that there's less density. It's about 500 burials per acre, as opposed to about 1,200 in a conventional cemetery. I think this slide is a really good illustration of what a hybrid cemetery is, or a hybrid burial might look like. It is essentially a natural burial, except one that occurs in a conventional cemetery, or a section of a cemetery that is surrounded by other graves that would have been conventional burials. And I think I see this as the low-hanging fruit, as it were, and the quickest way to get rapidly increase the availability of green burial. Because if you think about it, there's thousands of cemeteries around the country that have the infrastructure, they have the staff, they have the equipment to conduct burials. They just need to be educated on how to do it without vaults and liners. And there are definitely cemeteries that are starting to do it. And so this is what a hybrid cemetery might look like, and we do certify hybrid cemeteries. And the benefit of this, for example, is you might have, a husband who wants or has a conventional burial and died 10 years ago, and you might have a wife that wants a more natural burial, and they can have it side by side in the same place as well. This is a wonderful visual that's on our new website, and there's more about that coming in the presentation, showing the spectrum of body care methods in terms of environmental impact. Conventional burial is in the bottom of this pyramid, and local conservation burials are at the top. Flame cremation also is on the bottom. I mean, many people consider cremation to be greener because you're not using, caskets and liners and taking up space in the ground. But when you look at conventional flame cremation, obviously you're heating an oven using, natural gas or fossil fuels to 1600 degrees. And so there's that aspect of it. And then you're also going to have to deal with emissions. There's definitely ways to make cremation much more sustainable. And if you go places like Europe, where crematories are run by municipalities, often the energy created during the cremation process is harnessed and used to heat buildings, heat public swimming pools, melt snow on sidewalks, that type of thing. And they also have much more stringent regulation on emissions, and so are scrubbing the emissions much better. And I think that's going to be something we're going to see happen here in the coming years. I think what's really important here is that there are other methods of disposition in the middle, whether it's natural organic reduction, placing cremated remains into concrete reefs, or alkali hydrolysis, which is water or chemical, reduction of the body to bone. We wanted to really talk about this slide because there's a lot of confusion. There's some co-opting of what green burial is. And green burial is what I've described it to you. It's nothing else. Natural organic reduction might be a greener form of disposition than conventional burial. So might alkali hydrolysis, but they are not as green as what Mother Nature does on its own. These are artificial industrial processes that do have a carbon footprint. I think in some scenarios and in some areas, there is going to be a need for them just in terms of, the available land use. But, when I think about natural organic reduction, for example, I think about, instead of having cemeteries with green grass and trees, we're going to have massive warehouses filled with forklifts and racking with bodies that are, being reduced via the composting process. So, I think as we move down the road, there's going to be choices when families go to funeral homes, and all of these things might be on the menu, and it's going to be up to the consumer to pick what they want to do and what is meaningful for them and works for them. But I do think it's important to really set the record straight that, green or natural burial is the greenest of the green. So why does this matter? Well, accessibility. When green burial is represented correctly and consumers understand what it is, providers can more readily offer green services to the public. The impact, we want to ensure that services provided by providers, cemeteries, funeral professionals, product providers, are truly good for the earth, and that the providers actually deliver sustainable solutions. And they do what they say they're going to do. Also, trust. Funeral providers earn more trust when people understand the evidence-based practices behind the services they provide. And and they are independently and third-party approved. Trust is a key word here, as has historically been a lack of trust of funeral providers in some cases by the public, and general distrust of green burial practices as new quote unquote concept. Consumers sometimes report feeling ripped off, but when we're clear on what green burial is and hold providers to evidence-based and verifiable green standards and provide the education to the public, we can bridge the gap. And I want to, before I talk about how we're bridging the gap, I want to just, mention that, the vast majority of funeral professionals are doing the right things for the right reasons. Obviously, just like in every industry, there's going to be some bad actors and bad apples that ruin it for everyone. But the vast majority of funeral professionals are trying to do the right thing. And there's a huge shift in the industry. And so that's why it's so important for us to bridge this gap and educate funeral professionals, because it's a scary thing to be dealing with a family that wants something that, a funeral home may have never provided before or done before. And so for us to provide that education is really important to give them a level of comfort. And so, we do that as an organization. The GBC needs to bridge that gap between the funeral industry and families in need of funeral services. And we do that in three main ways: through certifying and connecting certified providers to families that are interested. And so we are creating standards that combat greenwashing and provide mapping of our network of providers. We also provide supplemental education that may not be provided at university programs, professional programs, and through trade associations where many funeral professionals get their education. And it's also really important to engage with the industry. We want to highlight the growing demand, and we want funeral directors to know the data that I just shared with you, so they know that there's that demand, and also the economic benefit of offering natural funeral services. If it's not something that they can generate revenues from, they may be less inclined to offer those services. We're also bridging the gap by connecting and certifying independent and rigorous certification. We're providing science-based standards reviewed by third-party volunteers to combat greenwashing. We provide maps and directories, which are an easy way to connect those wanting green burial with those certified to offer it. And we want to provide a seal of approval that represents integrity and gives consumers peace of mind. At the moment, we have about 165 certified funeral homes, 45 hybrid cemeteries, 25 natural cemeteries, 14 conservation cemeteries, and 51 product providers that are certified. And we're in the process of certifying 60 more funeral homes, 23 cemeteries, and 41 product providers, which is really exciting. And I think really speaks to the effort that we've made to engage with the industry and show them the value of independent certification and the ability to connect with consumers that are interested. And the way we've done that is through industry engagement. So we've gone to expos, we've exhibited at the New England Cemetery Association, the International Cemetery and Cremation Funeral Association in Las Vegas earlier this year, and we just had a table at the NFDA in Chicago. Webinars, we provide webinars like this, both to the public and to professionals, targeted to engage providers on natural burial services. And we've drawn over 1,400 attendees from across the globe last year. We've also been much more active in publishing articles and marketing. We do advertising, we do articles. We've been featured in the Southern Funeral Director Magazine, the ICCFA's Memento Mori. We also have our newsletter that has double the industry average open rate and triple for our certified providers in the industry. And I want to go back to, talking about the economic benefit. I grew up in Africa in the 80s, and I remember talking about conservation and white rhinos and elephant. And when I think about how they addressed that They addressed that by engaging with local communities. However, those local communities at that time were the ones that were poaching a lot of the elephants and the rhinos and selling those tusks and those horns for money. So part of the conservation movement was to engage those people and give them another economic benefit through ecotourism and conservation, right? And so the places in Africa that have had success with conservation are those places that have engaged, um, the people that were actually kind of complicit in the problem. And there's been some huge success stories there. And when I equate that to the funeral industry, there's probably some people that say we shouldn't engage the funeral industry. But I think we should for some of the reasons that I've also talked about. But if we're not educating them and showing them the economic benefit, because most of them are for-profit entities, then they're not going to be inclined to do it. And actually, when I was at the Time100 event in Rio de Janeiro, a big part of what they're talking about in every industry is how do we demonstrate the economic value of this so that people are inclined to get behind the movement and get behind the cause. Supplemental education, we're doing free public webinars. We do our website features much needed free guides to operating green cemeteries and funeral homes. We have green burial and funeral master classes through our comprehensive courses on redesigning the end, which help funeral professionals gain competency in green services. Again, they're lacking the information. Most of the time, up until quite recently, they haven't received a lot of education in mortuary schools. And so we're also providing programming at several mortuary colleges, including Wayne State University, Mercer Community College, and Arapahoe County College. And I know there's several others as well. I'm really excited to share our new website. We launched the website a few weeks ago. It was a lot of work, and it's been amazing redesign. And so you can have a look. We're scrolling through it with our video here. But in the spirit of bridging all of these, building all of these bridges and initiatives, we've made some great updates to our website to make it more accessible for both the industry and the public. And I'd like to show you a few of the pages and features on the website. What we're looking and scrolling through here is our homepage, which is some highlights of the work we're doing and key resources we like to showcase. So please feel free after this webinar to explore the website. Let us know what you think. And I'm going to walk you through some other key pages that help us engage both with the public and the industry. The other thing I'll mention, I'm not sure if you've noticed, but we've actually redesigned and modernized our logo as well, which is really exciting. Our proudest update is the addition of our About Green Burial page or section, which is a hub for defining what green burial is and isn't, which is, as mentioned, a key focus in building trust amongst consumers like you and the industry professionals you rely on. In this menu, we have our What is Green Burial page, resources to plan a green burial, and our gallery and stories and FAQs. Our What is Green Burial answers that question with one, graphics like this comparison of a conventional gravesite and a green gravesite, which we've reviewed already. A clear definition on what we mean when we say green and burial. Three, an in-depth review of the body, container, and land aspects of green burial that we've touched on previously. And it also has access to our past webinars that you can access for free on our YouTube channel. We also know that green burial has been a little bit niche in our recent history. So we have added a gallery page to show just how beautiful and dignified green burials are and what they can look like. Talking to both the public and providers, I've come across some hesitation simply because as a culture, we forgot what a green burial looks like. This was the way we buried our dead for thousands of years, and in many parts of the world still do that. Generations ago, obviously, this was the norm, and like I said, in many places still is. But as you can tell, many of these sites are quite beautiful. And if you think about it, cemeteries could be forests and meadows. They don't have to be places filled with granite markers and perfectly manicured lawns. Here's our plan, a green burial page that has free public resources to guide families on pre-planning and making final arrangements for themselves or loved ones. GBC certified providers are great at meeting our standards and are familiar with meeting the demand of natural death care. So these tools are designed to support that process or can be used with non-GBC providers if there isn't anyone in your area. These 3 guides are based off the feedback and questions we typically receive and include a guide for families attending a green burial, a planning guide for making your own arrangements, and 4 ways to ensure a green burial with non-GBC providers. Speaking of our providers, we now have made it easier to access our directory of GBC certified funeral homes, cemeteries, and product providers.
Okay.
Here is our cemetery provider map where you can type in your zip code and adjust the distance settings to find providers in your area. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the benefits we provide to our providers is that we enable them to get connected with consumers in their local area through this map feature that are interested in green burial. The same map is available for funeral providers. And again, the list of providers is on the left of the map and you can scroll through that. And we have a list of product providers that create sustainable and biodegradable caskets, urns, and shrouds, with many that can ship nationally and internationally. These are just some of our popular features on our site, but there's so much more. We have our webinar page with links to register for upcoming webinars on our Eventbrite and access a playlist of past webinar recordings for free on our YouTube channel. Our webinars are almost monthly with 10 free webinars a year, with half designed with the industry in mind and the other half with families, consumers, and the public in mind, so we again can build those bridges. We also have our donate page where you can make one-time donations via PayPal. So please keep an eye out for our end of year campaign this Giving Tuesday and donate. And of course, our volunteer page where you can now find specific roles we're looking for volunteers to fill. You can visit this site to browse the duties that keep the GBC operational and fill out our application to contribute your time and skills to our mission. Speaking of momentum, we want to continue bridging the gap over the next 3 years and continue growing the movement. So growing the network, we want more funeral professionals offering green burial. To do this, we need more funeral homes and cemeteries to see the economic benefit of green burial. Only then will they train, staff, and create products and services to meet this demand. In order to do this, we'll need to consistently and continuously engage with funeral professionals in their trade magazines and at trade association shows. We'll also need to continue to adapt our standards to provide the confidence, consistency, and transparency that consumers demand. We also want to build capacity, so we have the resources to support those wanting green burial. In order to provide the education and resources to both the public and the profession, we need volunteers to do much of the work and donations and fundraising to fund other initiatives such as science-based studies. It's expensive, changing, and outdated, slow to change industry. And we want to remain the authority, connecting them with professionals qualified to provide green burial. We need to remain impartial and independent and work with funeral professionals to give them a pathway to meeting consumers where they are. It does no good to demonize funeral professionals if we want them to change and adapt to offer more sustainable alternatives to what has traditionally been done. But as I wrap up this webinar, I would be remiss if I didn't again plug our end of year fundraising efforts. So please keep an eye out this Giving Tuesday for our Cultivate the Cause fundraiser, and don't be shy about donating. So Maura, I think we're more or less done. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to field any questions.
Absolutely. I had a couple that were messaged directly to me, so we'll start with those. But for everyone else, please feel free to drop your questions in the chat and we'll get to them as you leave them. So Sandra asked, how does the 100-year rule come into effect for hybrid cemeteries? And I believe she's referring to the law that exists in some countries where um, pre-purchased burial plots that go unused for whatever reason only have a 100-year um, purchase power.
Wow. That is not my area of expertise. I don't know if there's any other board members on the webinar that want to take that question.
Hi, Darren. This is Emily. I can answer that one. Um, you always want to look in your cemetery purchase contract, the interment contract, because it is less common in the United States for graves to have a expiration year on them like that. It does happen in some areas, but in the most part, it's going to be specific to the bylaws of the cemetery you're talking about, and a lot of them do have perpetual interments.
Awesome. Thank you.
Second one, kind of related. If one spouse had a conventional funeral, is there any way that the other spouse can have a green burial in the same plot to reduce land usage?
I'm not quite sure about that one either. I don't know. Emily, you want to take that one too?
Yeah, this topic just came up on the Conservation Burial Alliance, which is, of course, a different nonprofit organization that we're friendly with. And the conservation burial cemeteries do their best to follow the, highest, most rigorous environmental best practices with cemetery work. And the group was divided on this question, and it does depend somewhat on the ecosystem, depending on what region and state we're in. So you're right that double depth burial or multiple interment, it's going to reduce the total amount of acreage of how many plots are dug. On the other hand, with conservation, restoration of native plants and protecting the ecosystem, it's like we actually do more good the more burial there is. So, in a conservation setting, you have the burial, make, as Darren showed earlier in this call, the grave is narrower and shallower, so we're trying to like minimize the amount of disruption to that soil structure, the ecosystem there. And then the best practice, if you have a sensitive ecosystem, is to leave it. And a subsequent burial in the same spot would reduce or disrupt the healing that came back after the first burial. All the other thing about double depth burial or multiple interment is you need a lot bigger of equipment to make that hole. You have to dig a bigger hole, so we have a higher emissions toll from the extra depth on that. And the other thing about that is with the green burial, you want the shallower depth because it allows oxygen to reach the site where the body is, where this biological activity is returning the body to the soil. Those microbes do their work in the presence of oxygen. And if you bury 10 and 12 feet down, it becomes a zone that's devoid of oxygen. Now, that's kind of been the the conservation burial ethic on this question is they want to have a lessened density of bodies per acre to have the lightest possible touch and lowest possible footprint, lightest touch on the ecosystem and lowest footprint from the operations. Um, but someone came in from a cemetery that's on an island and it's in a forest and it's on a hill. And for them, they have so few possible sites in this forest that are clear enough for burial. Plus, they have a limit, overall on the acreage they'll ever be able to develop being on an island. And they said that, doing double depth burial there is allowing them to um, do more burial to keep families together and have a lesser impact on the forest because, yeah, they might be doing more disruption to the site, but they are disrupting fewer sites. And so more of the forest stays intact while more of the cemetery activity takes place in just these few possible locations. So, anyway, that's a summary of this email thread that just went around in the industry. And it does depend on your location, but overall, I wouldn't say that double depth burial is always a better land use because the more, one of the purposes of that type of conservation burial is to protect the land and enroll it into these restoration programs. So, the more acreage we can do that with, the better.
Thank you, Emily.
We also had a couple of general questions. Someone asked if they were permitted to share the Zoom with fellow doulas, and 100%. Everyone who's attending tonight will receive a link to the recording of this webinar, and we would love for you to share it and go find past webinars that are of interest to you and share far and wide. And they also asked how they can register for email updates from us. You can sign up for our newsletter on our website. And you can also connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn, where we regularly post what we're doing as well. So now for a Darren question. What would you say is the general temperature of those in the funeral profession to offering green burial and funeral options?
I think today, funeral professionals have changed from asking why should they offer greener alternatives to families to asking how. So that's a really positive thing. They're more interested in learning how to do it. They're realizing that there is more demand. And I think one of the big things that they are going to start to realize more is that there's a lot of people out there that chose cremation or thought they wanted cremation because they thought it was the more eco-friendly and affordable alternative to conventional burial. They knew they didn't want a conventional burial, and they thought the only option was cremation. I think the more people know that about green burial and the more readily available it is, and the more engaged the funeral professional is, we're going to see a tremendous increase in the availability of green burial. And so I'm really excited to see that tipping point being reached, because I've been doing this 25 years and it's only been the last few years that, we didn't get weird looks at conventions and stuff like that.
Another very common question, is green burial less expensive than conventional burial?
I think it can be, but it also cannot be. I mean, I think, and maybe Emily can chip in on this, but I know historically, I think with cemeteries, the graves in the cemetery may not be the same price everywhere. And I think it's kind of like, I'm going to use hopefully not a crass analogy, but like if you go to Hawaii and you get an ocean facing room, that room might be $500. And if you get a city facing room, that exact same room could be $200. And the same thing is probably true in a cemetery, where there's going to be some prime spots in that cemetery that might command a more premium price. And then, on the product The product side of things, there's inexpensive options like shrouds that are very simple. There are simple pine boxes and simple wicker caskets, but there are also more expensive options on the market like premium. There's some upgraded, sustainable and fair trade products. There's mushroom caskets that tend to be on the higher end of the range. And I think the same thing is also true of where you are. I mean, if you're in Manhattan or San Francisco in a major metropolitan area that is generally more expensive, you might pay more for a green burial than you would say in Oklahoma or New Mexico or some other place that generally speaking is um, more affordable.
Fantastic. And I know we had some death doulas here tonight, so welcome to doulas. How do home funeral practitioners and death doulas factor into this?
I think there's much more openness and acceptance both amongst the public. I think there is a movement amongst the general public to kind of take back what our deaths look like. Historically, in my opinion, with very good intent, funeral professionals, when someone died, they whisk the body away from the home or from the nursing home or the hospital, embalmed the body, prepared the body. The family came in, viewed the body, and the burial occurred. And it was almost like a death. The death didn't occur. It's like, whoa, what happened? I think there is definitely a movement for individuals, and I actually had an experience with this with my mother-in-law, um, to have people go into hospice, to have death doulas, to have people there to guide that transition from life to death. Whether that continues into, vigils at the home where the body is put on, dry ice for an extended period of time, several hours or a day perhaps or two, um, or whether there's a full-on home funeral. Those are things that I think are much more available today, and I think the consumer is more open to it. And I think, to be honest, I think more funeral professionals are seeing the value in it. And I think if you ask the right questions, they would be willing to say somebody died in the morning, not come and pick up the body until the afternoon, so the family can spend time with them, and approach it in a different way. So I think that's slowly changing, and I see the use and the prevalence of death doulas and home funerals definitely growing. And I do see in the future, the funeral industry being more open and engaged to working hand in hand with those professionals.
Absolutely. And it's also worth mentioning, I think, that state laws vary so much, that, certain states will require the use of a funeral home and others won't.
Yeah, good point.
So you did touch on this one a bit in your presentation, but it is a question that comes up so often. I think it's worth touching on again. What is the most sustainable disposition option, and is cremation better than conventional burial?
That's a good question. I think that we might need to do some more studies on that. I think if we look at generalities, I did mention in my presentation that there is a carbon footprint with cremation. But we can make it greener. So, whether it's the equipment that is more efficient, uses less fuel, emits less pollutants into the atmosphere, whether it's the use of products. I mean, there are new products on the market that can be used to cremate the body and that do not pollute the environment. So what a lot of people don't know is that most people that get cremated probably get cremated in a basic cardboard box. Sometimes there are upgrades to that, but those containers often have plastic liners, zip ties, polyester linings, those types of things that don't burn very cleanly. And so I think there's going to be a change. We can't put the rabbit back in the hat, I think the saying is, where I don't think cremation is going to go anywhere in the near future. I think at some point it will plateau and may start to deteriorate, but we have to find ways to make cremation more sustainable. And that can be done through, harnessing the energy created during the cremation process and using it for some good benefit. Um, Making sure that we're cremating products that don't emit toxic chemicals and using equipment that is efficient and clean, and also on the urn side, historically, funeral homes have offered urns made out of brass and marble and wood. And probably the worst one is if you don't want any of those products and you're not educated, you end up with a black plastic box, which probably hundreds of thousands of those end up in the landfill every year. And there are other options on the market for, more sustainable, renewable, biodegradable use um, for it as in terms of urns. So it can be much more sustainable than it currently is. And I think it will be in the future.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is that even if it's not a 100% natural process or you're going a more conventional route, there are still ways to be greener within that, no matter
Right.
what option you choose.
Exactly.
So, what about for people that don't have access to a GBC certified funeral home or cemetery? What about them? Can they still have a green burial?
Yeah, I think in most cases, depending on the state and the local regulations, yes, I believe they can have a green burial. And the other thing that is not uncommon, especially because there's not that many green cemeteries available or conventional cemeteries that will do a green burial. It's not uncommon for people to travel some distance to find the nearest green cemetery, whether they have a sentimental connection to that location or they just like the location or the philosophy or the mission of that cemetery. You don't have to at this stage look just in your neighborhood. If there's not a cemetery that will do a green burial, then I think you should look further afield because there are going to be options out there. The other option is the industry is going to change much quicker when the consumer is demanding it more. And so, if you go locally and they won't do it, I think it's important that they hear from you that that's something that you want, because until they hear that from more consumers, the change is going to be slow.
So, if you were going to a conventional cemetery, what would you have to ask for in order to have a green burial or to even find out if a green burial is possible there?
I think one of the big things you'd have to ask for is a burial without a vault. That's one of the things that seems to be relatively common. Most conventional cemeteries want to sell you a vault, but they also, in some cases, feel like they need a vault for operational reasons. That isn't always the case, especially when people are more educated, businesses are more educated. And so I think one of the questions to ask is, would you do a burial in your cemetery without requiring a vault? The other thing is, if they require a vault, you may be able to ask them to invert a vault so that your body actually rests on the earth and the vault covers your body. Obviously, that's not ideal, but we often talk about shades of green, and even the greenest of burials is going to have an environmental impact. So if we can all take small steps, will make a huge impact. The other stuff is kind of what I talked about in my presentation is, some kind of biodegradable container, whether it's a shroud or a pine box or something that's made of a sustainable resource that will biodegrade quickly. Yeah, I think that's what I got.
We had a webinar earlier this year with the national cemeteries for veterans, and they all allow green burial, which was a surprise to a lot of people attending. So if you are a veteran, even if you're not close to one of the three national cemeteries that are piloting an actual green burial section, you can still request a green natural burial because they have to accommodate all religious backgrounds.
That's a great point. The
So
other
that's
thing
another one.
Right. The other thing that makes me think is the Catholic Church is doing a similar thing. Many of the Catholic cemeteries in different dioceses around the country are exploring or opening green sections in their cemeteries.
Yeah, the Catholic cemeteries in my home county where I live here in Texas, are allowing shrouded burials without vaults. But you do have to be a member of their congregation for at least a year. Usually they have some stipulation. So it could be a way to drive people to the Catholic Church.
Right.
That is the end of the questions that we've received. So, unless anyone has any last minute questions, I think we may wrap up about 5 minutes early here. So, if not, thank you all so much for being with us tonight. I did drop the donation link there. As Darren mentioned in his presentation, the GBC is entirely volunteer run, and we do depend on your donations to keep offerings like this free and accessible. And I'd also like to thank Darren for his time. Thank you so much for presenting and explaining how we are working to build bridges within the funeral industry.
Thank you so much, Maura, and thank you everyone for attending.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
We will be sending out a link to this recording.